Good afternoon and welcome to the Blue Economy CRC's Collaborative Research Center's 6th webinar series for 2023. My name is Maya Schweitzer and I have the privilege of serving on the Blue Economy CRC's board. I'd like to begin on behalf of the Blue Economy CRC by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we all meet on today. For me, I'm hosting this webinar from Brisbane, Meanjin, the beautiful country of the Jagera and Turrbal peoples, but I know we're representing Indigenous country across Australia and perhaps even beyond this afternoon. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and I'd like to extend my respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders viewers in our webinar this afternoon. Now, the Blue Economy Collaborative Research Centre was established with a 10-year lifespan under the Australian government CRC program back in July 2019. We now have 44 participants from Australia and around the globe, and the purpose of the Blue Economy CRC is to perform world-class, collaborative, industry-focused research and training that ultimately underpins the growth of the blue economy through increased offshore sustainable aquaculture and renewable energy production. Today's webinar is about a very hot topic in that space. It's about hydrogen as a marine fuel, both the opportunities and the challenges. We know that the implementation of alternative fuels to the conventional fossil fuel-based fuels is key to the decarbonization of the global maritime and shipping industry. Green hydrogen is currently one of the prime candidates among alternative shipping fuels, green hydrogen and its derivatives, as it offers ship owners and operators a low carbon and low emission fuel option for potential use in internal combustion engines or fuel cells. However, as anyone in this space would know, there are many complex challenges concerning the adoption of green hydrogen in the shipping industry. And so this afternoon in this webinar, our 3 guest speakers will present on various topics related to the role of green hydrogen in decarbonizing the maritime industry and shed light on some of the main challenges and opportunities that the maritime industry is currently facing in this space. We're delighted to have as guest speakers Dr. Tom Beard, Senior Analysis Engineer at BMT, Associate Professor Peggy Chen, Director for the Centre of Maritime and Logistics Management at the Australian Maritime College and the University of Tasmania, and Dr. Hongjun Fan, Postdoctoral Research Fellow at the Australian Maritime College and University of Tasmania. So we'll hear from our 3 presenters first, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. So may I first hand over to Dr. Tom Beard from the BMT to take it away with his presentation, Alternative Fuels and Their Implications for Vessel Design.
Hi, thank you, Maya. I'm just going to share my screen. That's the one we want. So you should have a, yeah, that's it now. So yes, thank you for inviting me to speak. As Maya said, I'm Tom Beard. I'm a senior engineer at BMT. I also am the lead on alternative fuels. And so I'm going to give a brief overview of alternative fuels and the implications we have on vessel design. So what we'll do is I'll go over some of the options. This isn't just hydrogen on the options, but then we do a bit of a deeper dive into hydrogen storage, some of the generic safety issues that we have, and then go through vessel requirements and design requirements, and then some of the environmental considerations that we should factor in for hydrogen as well, and then a brief conclusion. So the options we have, obviously, I know we're going to talk about hydrogen, but I view it as hydrogen and its derivatives, simply because it's not necessarily hydrogen's going to be the perfect silver bullet. One guarantee is that any alternative fuel outside of electricity will require hydrogen if we want it to be green. So that is a benefit. I mean, we do have hydrogen. I've got LNG on here. Or you'd substitute that for synthetic natural gas, ammonia, metal hydrides, methanol, liquid organic hydrogen carriers, and then on the far column is a reference to marine gas oil. What you can see is one of the big issues we have, everything in red is for as a RAG score is low, amber is okay, green is good. Top 1 energy density, as you can see, anything involved with hydrogen is actually quite poor. This energy density includes the tankage that we require, so it does give us a bit more knowledge. I mean, if I took energy density, generally hydrogen is very high. When we factor in tanks, all of a sudden everything drops. And then obviously the storage conditions about how we can store them as well. I do know these slides are getting given, so I'm not going to go over everything. But some of the big ones are our safety risks. So with hydrogen, it's the massive flammability range that we have with a potentially low ignition energy. Although I would always advocate when I mention ignition energy, this 0.02 millijoules ignition energy for hydrogen is a stoichiometric mixture which sits at about 38% by volume. When you actually have hydrogen at a 10% volume, your ignition energy sits more at about 0.29, which is comparable to natural gas. So you do need to take things with a pinch of salt and actually understand what this means. So you've got to factor that in. Metal hydrides can be quite dangerous as well. They're pyrophoric, so they can just ignite in air. Some of them are water reactive as well. And because they're dusts generally, then you have potential dust explosions as well, which does give a major level of danger when we factor that in. Although it is noting that all of this is in the instance that we have an incident that then means that we have either a gas leak or, in metal hydride's case, the containment is breached. Ammonia isn't very flammable. Natural gas is around there. Ammonia is quite nice with this massive ignition energy in comparison to a lot of the other fuels. Liquid organic hydrogen carriers, they're very similar to diesel. You store them like diesel as well, which is, I quite like liquid organic hydrogen carriers, but they do have other difficulties which we'll get onto. As we all know, ammonia is highly toxic, which is the biggest danger with ammonia. Metal hydrides, it varies on the composition that we use. Methanol is toxic to humans, but isn't as toxic to aquatic life, which is quite nice. And the really good thing with methanol, I suppose, is that whilst it can get into a human system in various ways, one of the ways to get rid of that is by drinking vodka, because it actually flushes the methanol out of your system. It's just an ironic thing. It's slightly worrying if we have methanol on board vessels and then sailors realize that if they come into contact, that then they have to drink vodka or quite pure alcohol. Then you never know what they're going to get like. And then I've got the combustion emissions non-fuel cell. Everything will produce NOx if we burn it, and some of them will produce CO2. But the things we do are definitely mitigating is the SOx and particulate matter from marine gas oil. I know we've done a lot to get rid of SOx anyway, but the CO2 is still low for anything that's going to be carrying carbon. Other than that, we're just looking at NOx, which we do have to be careful of if we burn it, because it's still a greenhouse gas, or certain variants of greenhouse gases. Others have impacts on health as well. So jumping into the gas side of things, so for hydrogen gas, it's really nice. It's got minimum emissions. It's similar to automotive. Generally stored at high pressure. One of the worst ones is, as you can see, if I just go back one, is if we store hydrogen gas down low, if it was to leak, it's lovely, naturally buoyant, and it goes up. But up in a deckhead space on a vessel is where your light fittings generally are. So when they come on, it goes bang. So we need to account for this when we design things, which I will move on to a little bit later on. We do need infrastructure development still, and I know Professor Chen's going to talk about that later on, so I'm not going to go over that too much. There is potential for embrittlement with hydrogen, as always. The location on board, where do you store it? That's a very fun thing that we'll move on to later on as well. Liquid hydrogen, again, is minimal emissions. Actually, what's nice is that you can store it in a very similar manner to liquid natural gas. The variation is that for liquid hydrogen, we're going down to almost absolute zero at minus 253 degrees centigrade, whereas LNG sits at about minus 130. So there is a massive step change in that, which does have that added problem with the additional energy to get down to that low temperature, which is the cryogenic storage. And because you're cryogenic, you've got even more possibility of embrittlement because of this aspect. Again, you have potential issues about where you store it. If you think about the Suzo Frontier, which is the current liquid hydrogen carrier that runs between Australia and Japan, they've got above deck storage, and we manage it like that. Again, the infrastructure is an issue, and with all of this, you'll always, a recurring theme is the additional hazardous zones. So, liquid organic hydrogen carriers, you can store them similar to diesel, which is really nice because that means actually we have minimal changes to storage on board. They are also cyclic in nature. So the way it kind of works is you have your power supply, you have an allo-HC feedstock, which potentially, for using a simple case, is toluene. You hydrogenate your toluene with green or nuclear hydrogen, a renewable source of hydrogen, hydrogenate that, and then you get your actual allo-HC, which if you use toluene, that tends to methyl cyclohexane. On board your vessel, you keep it, you store it just like diesel, dehydrogenate, then you use the hydrogen, but you restore the dehydrogenated feedstock on board. You do not discharge. And then that means, so what that means by storing that on board, you keep the vessel at almost constant trim. There's very little difference, which actually means you can design more efficient vessels, which is really good. Problems with this requires a significant investment in infrastructure, far more than just using cryogenic or even compressed hydrogen, because we need to have the plant available to rehydrogenate when we get to shore. We also have onboard dehydrogenation. That takes power, that takes energy. So we do have a difficulty there, and it is toxic, even if it is only slightly. And now finally for hydrogen is metal hydride. So it's quite a nice one to store on board because you store it in a canister. It's great. You have hydrogen, basically you have it around your cylinder. You absorb the hydrogen on by cooling it. You get it there. When you want the hydrogen off, you add heat and you desolve the hydrogen again, which is really good. There is user cases of metal hydrides already on board vessels. There are various navies across the world that use metal hydrides at times. What is also good is potentially we can modularize this, so it makes it easier. So we don't have to do our absorption on board the vessel. We can take the metal hydride off and have it as a plug and play container system potentially. And because you have to add heat to an extent, unless there's fire, it self-mitigates its release. But as similar to allo-HC, you need that onboard dehydrogenation. We need to add the heat in to get the hydrogen off. And again, depending on how we run metal hydrides, we may need to have this shoreside infrastructure development if we use plug and play. Otherwise, we may have vessels alongside for quite some time whilst we absorb the hydrogen back on. As I mentioned before about the safety risks, there is a risk because it is generally a powder of dust explosions if this happens, and the pyrophoric nature. But one of the biggest problems with metal hydride is the uniformity. So there are various metal hydrides that we can buy that are almost off the shelf, already developed. I also know there's significant research going on into metal hydrides, which is trying to beef up and get a far greater energy density. The problem with that is what works in a lab doesn't correlate across to when you go to full scale. So I know some that have worked very well in a laboratory scale at a university, and when they've gone to mass produce, it's gone from being a superstar to being absolutely rubbish. So we need to balance that and ensure that we know how we're going to build and create the metal hydride such that we can transfer from lab scale up onto full capacity. Now it's the generic safety. So the way it basically happens is we have damage on board our vessel. We would have a loss of containment. Generally, you have a release of gas or liquid, or the metal hydrides are slightly different because that will just ignite in air generally. And then we go up, so we either have an immediate ignition where we get flames and fires, potentially a fireball, especially if it was compressed hydrogen, or if there is a delayed ignition, then we get a gas cloud or vapor forming, and then we have a delayed ignition, which is a deflagration or potentially an explosion depending on where it's stored. Or in the case of something like ammonia, you get the toxic cloud form, which again we need to manage. So we need to ensure that we're happy with that and how we can mitigate all of these potential risks on the basis that there is a loss of containment. I'm going to briefly just discuss this. So one of the things that we see a lot is how we bunker safely. How do you do this? And I believe Professor Chen's going to go over some of this later on. My personal view is this is a system about how they recharge hydrogen cars. To hydrogen dispenser. This is a hydrogen car where it's plugged in. This is for compressed gas, but the way it works is you have a data coupling such that if this breaks, the refueling completely stops. I think that's a really good way of how we could potentially mitigate that. Right, some of the requirements of vessels though, so that's all about safety and about some of the fuel. One's fuel availability. In Australia, I know there's a very big push for hydrogen, which is brilliant, and we're going to do that. In other nations, it's not quite the same. The fuel availability is a bigger problem when we look at deep sea shipping. Generally, these require higher energy densities. A lot of people are going towards ammonia or methanol, at least right now, because it's more available. And the issue with that is then we need to have it bunkered at all the ports we go to, which is why there's a very big push at the moment for green corridors. So if we take Singapore, they will have agreed the fuels will be at both ports for the vessels going along that trip. Short sea shipping, we've got the potential to use lower energy densities. That's where hydrogen really can come into its own, and electricity as well. So we could just go straight to batteries. But the other thing we need to factor in is the vessel usage. So cargo carriers versus passenger vessels, which I'll just delve into a little bit now. So cargo vessels, generally they have a low population density, and the crew is normally very highly skilled, which is brilliant, and it allows us to segregate areas. This is a picture of a Tide class tanker for the Royal Fleet Auxiliary, which is a naval vessel that refuels warships at sea. This is slightly different, but this is a BMT design, which is why I've used this. This one has a crew of about 110. Most carriers like this, generally in a commercial setting, you're talking maybe about 20 people, which is far better. But it can carry over 20,000 cubic meters of liquid. So, but what that means is that we can segregate up, and so we can distance and save the people and keep them safe regardless of where the fuel is on board. And the reason I pull this one up is because cargo compared to passenger vessels, so this is a Pentland Islands ferry. Ferries are far more difficult. They have high population densities. You have lots of unskilled people on board. So you have passengers which don't know what to do in the event of an accident. And it also makes it potentially very difficult to segregate areas because you have people all over the vessel. This one carries 430 passengers. It only has a crew of 12 and carry 110 vehicles as well. So on something like this is where do you store the hydrogen when you have a vehicle deck full of cars? You have people all over the vessel, and so you need to factor that in. And so from here, I'm going to delve now quickly into design considerations. So these are BMT's vessel designs. So this is one of our CTVs, crew transfer vessels, workboats. That's a catamaran, and this is one of our super yacht designs. Basically, everywhere that, so it depends where we store it. So on the super yacht, we've got storage below deck, which means this is all gas tight. And then by gas tight, this is where it makes it very difficult for retrofit. Gas tight is very easy for a new build because you can ensure and test it. It's very difficult to ensure that a compartment is gas tight if you are retrofitting, and you've got to do far more work, which can be a problem. You also need airlocks and or water curtains surrounding anything that carries the fuel. So in here, if I take the GA here of the CTV, if we've got fuel here and the prime mover here, we need to ensure both compartments not only are gas tight, but also the entrance into them has an airlock and potentially a water curtain as well. And you need alarms such that people know that if they're entering that area, well, they can't enter the area if there's been a leak. So for instance, it potentially on here, we could say, right, if we enter into here from a opening up here, then we need an airlock somewhere here, which then segregates out. You wouldn't necessarily need an airlock between the two compartments, but you need a route there. On a smaller vessel, it gets quite difficult. If we were looking at a retrofit, generally we wouldn't try to store it below deck because we cannot ensure this gas type boundary. That's when we'd be looking at potentially above deck storage. And so if we take hydrogen, we put the hydrogen cylinders potentially up here, out of the way of people, but also, especially for hydrogen, as we all know, hydrogen's got that inbuilt safety mechanism, and the fact that it's highly buoyant, it's the most buoyant chemical we have, and it's highly diffusive. What we need to ensure is that if there is a leak, we do not entrain that leak anywhere, so we can't capture it into an airlock, into an air vent. So if we have air vents, that's why you wouldn't necessarily want hydrogen, if it's stored here, just venting up on the outside here, because there's a risk that we can then, the hydrogen can be entrained inside the working space up here where all the passengers are. One thing that I'm a big advocate of is redundancy. So there are regulations on vessel size about when a vessel's of a certain size, it must have a mechanic. The problem is, if we're dealing with hydrogen, ammonia, methanol, these are all highly flammable and or highly toxic. And so then we have a difficulty, because you can't be putting your mechanic going down into an engine space because something's gone wrong. So then you need this level of redundancy to mitigate that. It's worth noting that some of the best vessels that deal with redundancy and explosive and toxic atmospheres, we've been doing this for decades in ship design. It's just warship design. Explosive atmosphere is your munitions on board a warship. Toxic atmosphere relates to chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear warfare, CBRN warfare. We do this already, so we have an inherent knowledge on how to design to accommodate and mitigate explosive and toxic atmospheres, and with the redundancy as well. But depending on where it goes is an impact on how we store everything. Like I said, retrofit is far more difficult. It can be done though. So finally, just move on to some of the environmental considerations. I don't like the term, but hydrogen is an indirect greenhouse gas. Now, what I don't like about this is the fact that when we talk about hydrogen, in every way we see it, hydrogen is referred to as its fugitive emissions, which makes it sound bad. When you talk about methane, which is also a greenhouse gas, it's methane slip. So to me, we as an entity, as a race, and as engineers as well, and scientists, we should use the same. It's either fugitive emissions for everything, or it's just hydrogen slip. We shouldn't, just because it's the way it's being purveyed, calling it fugitive makes it sound worse than slip. Slip's an accident, so okay, it's a bit of methane slip, ammonia slip, oh well, that's a little bit of an accident. Fugitive emissions sounds far worse. That's something that I personally don't like. I think we need to move away from. It should all be fugitive, or it should all be slip. We do have a problem when we burn hydrogen with the NOx. We can manage that to an extent, but then you're not getting complete combustion, so that we need to manage that. You're not getting that efficiency saving off the engine. If we talk about fuel cells, however, they just produce water, which is ideal. However, we do need to be careful, because we are basically producing pure water. So if we pump that overboard, then it is considered a pollutant, because we are changing the local sea state, the salinity and everything else changes. I know that at the moment most hydrogen is produced by grey means, so coal or gasification, and from LNG. But when we move to blue hydrogen, that's probably the next step. So the hydrogen carbon capture, that's probably where we need to go, whilst we are creating enough energy, renewable energy, to create the amount of green hydrogen that we need. And the problem with that is that it does require significant energy for the production and the infrastructure. So just to conclude it, really, each fuel or storage medium has positives and negatives, but we do need hydrogen no matter what. Significant, which as I've said before, Professor Chen's going to talk about, there is significant infrastructure required for this. If we move to retrofit on board existing vessels, that's when my personal view is that we should look to external storage. It's far easier to mitigate. And when we go to new build, then we could go below deck. Again, there are different things that we need to account for. Thank you for listening to me. My email address is there. I know the slide's going out. If you've got any questions, obviously we've got the Q&A later. So thank you ever so much. Cheers.
Thank you very much, Tom, for that comprehensive introduction. I learned a lot listening to you about how to think about some of these challenges, and you've already sparked a lively debate in the Q&A. May I now invite Associate Professor Peggy Chen to take over for our second presentation on ports, opportunities, and challenges in the global hydrogen supply chain.
Yeah, so Tom, yeah. So to share my screen. Okay. And see, so I think that should be correct. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I think from Tom's saying that it seems I'm going to talk a lot on the infrastructure investment part, but actually my presentation is broader than that. This is really based on our just completed project, on the ports opportunity and challenge in global hydrogen supply chain. So we look at all the challenges faced by ports to accommodate all the new development of the hydrogen and the derivatives. So probably a big background here is that we all know hydrogen is a clean energy source for decarbonization and including the maritime transportation. In order to develop this hydrogen economy, we all know land, power, water, and port are major elements of infrastructure. So because ports, a lot of projects happen near the port or within the port about the hydrogen or related projects. So it could be the hub of the hydrogen industry from production and to consumption, which is used to decarbonizing our port assets. Despite the importance of ports in the hydrogen supply chain, actually in 2021, we found there were limited studies in this area, and that motivated the team to do this research. So the project we just completed was funded by the International Association of Maritime Universities, and this project aimed to investigate how ports can best facilitate international hydrogen trade, and also how to utilize hydrogen to decarbonizing our ports. And the research partner, including Australian Maritime College, and led by myself and Kobe University and the Liverpool John Moore University. So the study period is 2022 May till this year, May. At the beginning, when we look at all the top 20 greenhouse gas emission countries, we realize actually 16 of that already have raised hydrogen in their energy strategies. I mean, for example, Japan actually was the first country to issue the national hydrogen strategy in 2017, followed by South Korea and Australia in 2019. So when we read through all the different strategy, then we discover some potential exporters and importers to make the international hydrogen trade. For example, Australia, Middle East could be the exporters, and in the East Asia, like Japan, or Southeast Asia and Europe could be the importer of that. So this study, actually, we pick up countries from Australia, Japan, and the UK, the ports as research subjects. It's because these three countries actually are at the front line of the hydrogen industry development. When we look at the hydrogen supply chain, as Thomas mentioned, all the different ships, the new design may use a different fuel, such as maybe the liquefied hydrogen or maybe the ammonia or methanol. So for ports, there are quite a lot of challenges because they need to consider which form of the hydrogen. I mean, if you look at the diagram here, like ammonia, methanol, and also the liquid organic hydrogen carrier. So this diagram just show you the supply chain from the exporting and to the importing and the different infrastructure related. And also for ports, they need to handle maybe from the production side or involved, or they need to handle the logistics activity, even providing bunkering for the vessels or the refueling for the logistics like a truck for their use of hydrogen. Initially, so if you look at all these, the different elements of the supply chain, the challenges actually occur along the chain. And that's why we try to investigate all the challenges and opportunities for ports and find out some solution. So the research framework for this project, actually we use literature review and interview survey. And from the literature review, and we already published a paper in the International Journal of Hydrogen Energy this year. So we reviewed the port readiness to facilitate international hydrogen trade. And the following the review, we did 27 interviews to industry professionals, 13 in Australia, 9 in Japan, and 5 in the UK, including ports and producer, exporters, importers, shipping company, and governments. After that, we identify a lot of issues. Then we go to the survey to survey the experts, just covering the ports and exporter and importer, because they export and import and also produce, and also port operator. They may understand the readiness of all the infrastructure required, and also some issues there. So that's the research framework. So the following, I'm trying to really bring my 90 pages report into maybe the 15 slides and to share some findings with you. Okay, so I will talk about some brief findings from this. And the first one is opportunities for ports. Yeah, it's a lot of challenges, but we will say that there are very, very good opportunities for ports involved in the hydrogen supply chain. For Australia, I mean, many participants really mentioned that becomes a major exporter of renewable fuels. And they also, because in the meantime, like Thomas mentioned, we need a lot of energy to produce, hydrogen and derivatives. So we also need to import a lot of renewable energy infrastructure equipments or elements. For port decarbonization, also it becomes a quite good opportunity as well. And in Japan, because they are importing countries, so the opportunity is also enhance their port function in handling the hydrogen and increase the volume. But also they want to become the carbon neutral ports, very clear. And they also want to decarbonize in their heavy industry near the ports. For UK, it's a little bit interesting because they consider the future energy demand for ports. So they involve in this area, try to increase in the port's resilience to future energy. They also try to provide a greater mix of energy for port customers or for ports themselves. So these are all the opportunity for ports. In the interview, we also asked about the participants about their potential market for export, or maybe the import, what to use. So for example, in Australia, in this diagram, you will see in WA, I think the market in the fertilizer industry, power generation, or as a marine fuel. But some of them also mentioned exporting is a big thing to Japan or Singapore. Tasmania is also very complex because we have multiple, the hydrogen family here. I mean, like methanol, probably the first project already confirmed to go ahead, and then the ammonia. And that could be used to export, but now talking more about the domestic use as well. In Japan, you will see in the Kansai area, I think that's here, they look at the liquefied hydrogen. That's because they have pilot project with Australia in Victoria. And that's why their focus is liquefied hydrogen. And they mainly import for power generation, for firing the power plant. and they imported from different sources. They already had quite a few pilot projects. For UK, it's mainly from Scotland, and they want to utilize their offshore wind to produce hydrogen, and they can export the hydrogen to Europe, EU mainland, and focus also in ammonia and methanol. Yeah. But I think UK now has more projects ongoing. And this is just based on our literature review and also the interview. And we identified some, hydrogen ports here. But as I mentioned, this area moves very fast, so there should be more on the map. And the right-hand side is some, the infrastructure lab and facilities participants identify. Yeah, just on the list. I don't want to just read through them, but we will. In the survey, we will ask the participant to really rate readiness for this infrastructure. I want to mention some, Tom's mentioned about the risk on board when they use a different fuel. But for hydrogen, actually, it's a new commodity for ports, and it's essential to establish a new really risk management system from scratch. But I think for ammonia or methanol, they already in the industry operate, and even for ports, in ports, they already operate. So some participants, they don't really think that the risk associated to was a really big problem. But the issue is that before ammonia and methanol, they are used for fertilizer industry or they use as a chemical feedstock. They haven't been handled as a large scale energy commodities. That's why that imposed the challenge and risk to the ports. So for this diagram, table, you will see, we found that if you look at the final one, the leak and spill, it just like Tom's already mentioned, all the explosive toxicity and from the hydrogen and also ammonia or methanol, and what's the large scale of the potential impact. And that's probably also the risk to ports when they handle all these cargoes. So for training and education, it's interesting because it seems that there are some available training programs in the market in the 3 countries, but the programs mainly focus on basic knowledge, not much in the real training, the real world operation. So the interviewee also suggests ports to have, the safety, health, materials, equipment, cargo operation, or cost-effective instance emergency response training on an education program. And that's really required. Talking about standards even are interesting because we all know that standards is very important for managing hydrogen. And for ammonia and methanol, actually, there are standards for safety and the environmental aspects there. But for even hydrogen, international standard also exists, such as ISO standard or IEC standard. But they actually, those standards are used just for industrial use, not for hydrogen or its derivative as an energy source. And that's why there's a significant gap in standards and costs for ports. So to ensure the efficient handling of H2, I mean, standardization is necessary, such as for ports, all the storage, pipeline, import, transportation, loading and loading process. And also some participants also suggest the certification standards for the cleanness of hydrogen also, and derivatives also very important. We also asked the participants about their view, okay, for ports, did they think about is a national or international standards required? And majority of them said the international standard prefer. It could be maybe because ports like shipping, they are international industry, and they argue the same cargo moving from the exporting to the importing port, they should apply the same standards. So that's related to our standards. So we look at the challenge really port confront if we just consider hydrogen as a marine fuel or decarbonization for ports. Actually, like Thomas mentioned, you need to handle that, or you need to produce that or provide bunkering. So the challenges related to that can be look at from the port development perspective. So there are challenging layers such as a land use, uncertainty of demand, because some participants they don't think the demand is quite certain, although there may be some potential trade, but domestic use the demand or even what's happening in the downstream for the shipping companies, what fuel they want to use, that's also quite uncertain at this moment. So that's caused the challenge, and also the infrastructure and standardization, etc. But interesting, when we look at the hydrogen application in ports, they were asked, do they consider that? And then they said that they haven't really decided because maybe using the electrification or the H2-based fuel, not really. But all for the governance model, some ports say we are landlord port, we don't manage cargo, and we don't provide marine services. So it's mainly the operators if they consider using that. But you also let me think about that, how the stakeholders can collaborate together to encourage using hydrogen or derivatives, for decarbonization in ports. For hydrogen refueling and bunkering, the same. I mean, it's uncertainty in the downstream hydrogen application market that really help the port to make a decision if they want to provide such a service in the port. And that's also the chicken egg dilemma, because some port may say, I don't have this availability to do that. But in the other hand, they want to think about, okay, if the demand is there. So the final bit for the interview finding is government support. It's interesting to see among these three countries, Japan has received a very good support from governments, like a national carbon neutral port initiative. They even has a subsidy of 50% of the cost of extending the key for the hydrogen importation. And UK also have some, the main purpose for the ports. Australia, yes, we have, but it's mainly from the hydrogen project money. So the participants really suggest a lot, especially for the financial support. And I think carbon tax and also the direct finance support were mostly mentioned. And from the regulation policy side, they really, for ports, they suggested to set in the port emission target, and that will encourage ports to use hydrogen or derivative for decarbonization. So this is for the government support. It's because mindful of time, I'm just jumping into the survey findings, and there are more interesting information you may want to know. So the survey finding, the first we asked about the berth utilization. Because this has been raised, in the conversation between us with the participants in the interview stage. And we say, do you prefer using a common use berth or dedicated berth to accommodate the hydrogen and all the derivative? And actually 16 respondents prefer dedicated berths. It could be maybe that some dedicated berths already exist, especially in Australia, like WA, they already have all the dedicated berths for the different use. So this is the interesting finding here. And then is that, okay, what's the respondents' intention to utilize hydrogen in ports? 10 say yes, 9 maybe. So yeah, it's sort of, and quite high intention to do that. And the assets they want to decarbonize using hydrogen or derivative include forklifts, like yard trucks, and the tugboats. I think tugboats is really using hydrogen, and to decarbonize could be the good choice. And the bunkering and refueling, I think 13 respondents say, yes, we intended to provide refueling and bunkering service at ports, and 6 maybe. And then the fuel type, they probably prefer, the first one is ammonia, and then methanol, and liquefied hydrogen is the next. I think that's probably because the downstream, the technology hasn't really matured for vessel to use liquefied hydrogen. But like Thomas said, maybe the short sea shipping could use the hydrogen, and that may also create port willingness to do the bunkering for those small vessels. And for the infrastructure requirement, you remember we identified those infrastructure from the interview, and then in the survey, we asked them to also confirm, so what are the infrastructure requirements for their ports? And of course, different ports, because they manage different types of hydrogen. So hydrogen forms, so they may count different, mostly the importance of the each infrastructure. But having said that, we asked them to rate the sufficiency level of those infrastructure. And you will see the three table here. The 5 is acceptable, but I think the majority of the poor infrastructure and facilities are below 5 across the 3 countries. You may say UK only 2. Yeah, that's very unfortunate. We only got 2 responses from 2 ports in the UK. But if you look at Australia and Japan, it seems that's really just under the acceptable level, except birds in Japan and the UK. So it shows that overall poor infrastructure and facility not just really fall below the acceptance range. And then we also identify 5 critical factors from the interview. One is regulation and standard, infrastructure, safety measure, personal training, and also the government support. And we also asked the participants to rate the readiness level of this critical factor for operating hydrogen imports. And you will see the result is similar. I think it's all below 5, probably except Australia in the safety measure is about 5. So which means that the readiness for those critical factors in 3 countries still in the development stage. So still a way to go, I mean, for the 3 countries. So based on the findings from the interview and survey, actually we developed a framework for operating hydrogen ports. If you look at this above, I mean, we have 3 main components in this framework. The first one is a key element for hydrogen logistics imports. So this is mainly focused on exporting and importing ports on the left and the right-hand side. So if you look at the export side, so ports actually, the initial task is to transition themselves to import the necessary infrastructure or elements for producing hydrogen and its derivatives. So that's why there may be required new berths such as offshore wind farm and solar, etc. Or even we need to import electrolyzer if we don't produce, nationally, domestically. So you need the more berths to accommodate that. From the production side, if the production happen near the port or in the port, then the conversion into the ammonia or methanol or the compressed hydrogen, you need also the conversion facility, and the storage tank is key to the port. And then it has to be, for example, pressurized and low temperature pipeline are essential to for the hydrogen and derivative for transportation as well. So we need a dedicated berth or a common use berth for loading and unloading those into the ships. So from the importing port here on the right-hand side, we could see they may be equipped with a liquid berths or container berths, because some hydrogen may transport by ISO tank, and that may need the yard or the container berths to manage it. And then the derivative may be converted into the pure hydrogen and distribute to the market. So importing ports, they may need some, to reconvert the ammonia and methanol into the pure hydrogen. So this is and for the in the middle in the diagram, you can see that's for the bunkering and also the facility that ports can provide for refueling, staging, or the bunkering. Yeah, so you need a bunkering barge. So these elements really show all the key components port need to have to get involved in the supply chain. Yeah, and the other component of this, framework is the working process. I think we already mentioned from the previous slide. So the first, that need to acquire sufficient land. Then the second is to involve the evaluation of the environment, safety and security. And the third one is really in the focus on the construction or renovation of the older port infrastructure to accommodate the different type of fuel or the commodities. And then step 4 is to do the economic assessment or the financial feasibility. And the final is to adhere to international and local standards. And that's very important to have a safe and efficient, effective hydrogen operation in ports. And the final actually is the government support. And that's very important from the government, from funding, incentive, and also the regulation policy and the community engagement, and also the green certification of hydrogen and derivatives. So mindful of the time, so the final slides, actually our research also provide some recommendations, and I categorize in this. So I think for the maybe to really follow the theme today, actually accelerating port infrastructure development is very important, and also increasing incentive for ports to support decarbonization and also the practical training and understand the safety is very critical for ports and shipping in the hydrogen economy. So the report will be released maybe end of the year. It will already finish. So if you are interested, you could require a copy and let you to read the information. So that's all from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Peggy. That was a perfect follow-on and super informative about some of the challenges. There's plenty of work to do, that's for sure. Now, can I invite our third and final speaker, Dr. Hongjun Fan, to talk to us about the feasibility of using hydrogen as a marine fuel, specifically in Australia.
Yes, first let me share my screen. Can you see my screen okay?
It's perfect. Thanks, Hongjun. And can I just add before you kick off that there have been a number of great questions put into the Q&A. If you particularly love one of those questions, you want to make sure it's answered, please just give it a thumbs up, and we'll prioritize the questions that have the most thumbs up when we come to Q&A after Dr. Fan's presentation.
Sure. Thank you, Mia, for your kind introduction. Hello, everyone. Today, I'm going to present some very interesting research findings from our ongoing Blue Economy CRC project. The project is hydrogen powering of vessels. This project is led by Mr. Andrew Harris from BMT. The objective is to do a feasibility study on using hydrogen and hydrogen's carrier ammonia on vessels. Currently, we have 12 research partners, including governments, universities, ship owners, consulting companies, ship designers, AMSA, and a classification society. The project started in February of this year, and it's a 2-year project. Today, I'll share some findings over the past 6 months. I'm going to talk through 4 parts. Firstly, we'll look at the carbon reduction target for Australian vessels and the possible solutions to reach the target. Second, we'll discuss the role that hydrogen can play in decarbonizing Australian vessels. Third, I'll introduce a case study that we are still working on. We'll see the differences between diesel system and the hydrogen systems. Finally, we'll summarize the presentation and outline our next phase work. So let's look at the first part. Under Australian flag, there are 2 types of vessels: international navigation merchant vessels and domestic vessels. The international vessels must follow the IMO's decarbonization trajectory. In July of this year, IMO has set a new target for international shipping to reach 0 emissions by 2050 or around 2050, depending on different countries' situations. As for domestic vessels, they must align with the Australians' decarbonisation target. Australian government has set a target to reach net zero by 2050. And for the transport sector, it has the potential to reach zero before 2050. So we can see that whether international or domestic vessels, 2050 is the deadline. Our project only focuses on domestic vessels. So we have a question here. How many emissions from Australian domestic vessels? Let's look at this. Australia's total emission in 2020 to 21 fiscal year were 465 million tons CO2 equivalent. After of them, the transport sector accounted for 20%, which was 90 million tons. Domestic vessels emitted 2 million tons. It's only 0.42%, not a lot, but we must take the responsibility. From 2 million tons to zero within 27 years from now on is the challenge we are facing. This 2 millions is our enemy to fight against, so we should have good weapons. The clock is ticking, but the question is where to start with. Unlike the international shipping fleet, small-sized vessels, less than 50 meters long, dominate Australian domestic vessel fleet. According to EMSA, as of July of this year, there are 8,700 small vessels operating in Australian waters with valid certificates. If we zoom in this number, we can see that 3,600 vessels are over 20 years old. This means that these vessels will be replaced with new building vessels within the next 10 years. So we have the opportunities to put thousands of zero-emission vessels in Australian waters within the next 10 years. But the question here is, how do we do that? This is the family tree of the shaping decarbonization solutions. We are talking about zero emissions. So we have biofuels and green electricity. In the electricity pathway, we can use battery and e-fuels. E-fuels include hydrogen, e-ammonia, e-methanol, and e-LNG. So what's the impact of using these fuels for a vessel? So let's look at this. If we use fuel oil, we consider the volume and the weight of the fuel to be 1 unit. Let's compare different fuels based on the same energy value. I think Thomas have explained this very clearly. Apparently, e-fuels are better than batteries. When it comes to risks, we are facing new de-risking challenges, of course. In this project, we are exploring the feasibility of using hydrogen and e-ammonia, but this doesn't mean we are against the other options. The first step, we focus on hydrogen. So how can hydrogen decarbonize Australian domestic vessels? Let's look at the second part. Hydrogen is a direct energy carrier of renewable electricity, and well-to-wake emission of using hydrogen could be reduced to near zero. No air pollutants, no toxicity, and hydrogen storage and PEM fuel cells technologies are mature. However, some challenges must be overcome, as Thomas mentioned. For example, high pressure and cryogenic storage, fire and explosion, lack of regulations, unavailable bunkering infrastructure, and the green hydrogen supply chain have yet to be built, as Professor Peggy Chen mentioned in her presentation. Fortunately, as of today, globally, there are 41 existing hydrogen-powered vessels. These vessels give us valuable knowledge, and most existing vessels are less than 50 meters long. This caters to Australian domestic vessel scenarios. The existing vessels include passenger vessels, cargo barges, containers, tugboats, and reef boats. And most of vessels' powers are less than 200 kilowatts, quite small. Only one existing hydrogen vessel with the power exceeding 1 megawatt, reaching 1.2 megawatt, which is an inland container barge in Europe. As the hydrogen technology matures, we are very happy to see that more and more large vessels will use hydrogen fuel cells at megawatt level before 2030. The largest one will be 23 megawatt. It's quite large. The fuel cell system includes the stack and it's a balance of plant BOP systems. The fuel cell stack is like an onboard power generation plant. The BOP system includes the hydrogen supply system, air supply system, and the seawater cooling system. And we did a preliminary assessment of the readiness levels of onboard hydrogen technologies. The levels are measured on a scale of from 0 to 9. As for energy conversion, we can see that PAM fuel cells have reached a full commercial application. So we gave it a level 9. Internal combustion engines and solid oxidation fuel cells are under development. For onboard storage, compressed hydrogen tanks are mature, and cryogenic liquid hydrogen has been used on a Norwegian ferry, so we give it a 8. Metal hydride method have been demonstrated on a few test boats, and high pressure hydrogen bunkering and liquid hydrogen bunkering technologies have reached the level 7 to 9. Could be truck to ship, portable tank swapping, or onshore station to ship. Therefore, in our opinions, an initial technical combination for small-sized vessels could involve the use of PAM fuel cell plus compressed hydrogen. And the bunkering availability is a key factor. Australia has started to build hydrogen supply chains. Australia's first commercial hydrogen refueling station has opened in Port Kembla just a few weeks ago. It's a good start for future bunkering stations in ports. Professor Peggy has introduced the AAMU project. That project also conducted a survey to ask the participants' willingness to provide hydrogen refueling or bunkering services in ports. 13 participants from Australian ports and hydrogen producers answered this question. 11 said yes. This is a good signal for the availability of hydrogen bunkering in Australian ports, but more solid works need to be done. Economic performance is essential for using hydrogen on vessels. We have compiled data regarding the CapEx and OpEx of hydrogen vessels. This data will be a foundation for our case studies. Regulatory readiness is very important. In this regard, IMO has issued guidelines for fuel cells. However, there are no IMO regulations on hydrogen storage, bunkering, and safety systems on board. IMO's regulations for hydrogen-powered vessels are under drafting and might be completed until 2025 or 2026. AMSA has released a novel vessel policy statement in 2022, including hydrogen as a marine fuel. Some classification societies have developed their rules for hydrogen-powered vessels, including ABS, BV, CCS, DNV, KR, and LR. These class rules address some requirements not covered by the IMO regulations. So AMSA may accept the application of these rules to facilitate alternative design approaches for hydrogen vessels. Standards Australia has planned to establish Australian Hydrogen National Standard System, which will be very helpful for using hydrogen on vessels. Some professional organizations have also developed the guidelines. Given the lack of IMO regulations, in this project, we proposed this process for designing hydrogen-powered vessels. It combines the established regulatory design process and the alternative risk-based design process. Now we have technologies, we have regulations, class rules, and standards, even though not enough. And we have a design process. So it is possible. It is very possible to design and build hydrogen-powered vessels in Australia. How does a hydrogen-powered vessel look like? Usually, she has bunkering manifolds, fuel tanks, fuel supply systems, fuel cells, batteries, and switchboards, electric motors, and the safety systems, for example, the gas venting system. We are quite familiar with the traditional diesel vessels. And what are the differences between diesel system and the hydrogen system? Let's go to the next part, a case study. We used an existing diesel-fueled high-speed catamaran ferry as a reference vessel. She's 29 meters long, can accommodate 190 passengers. Her operational limited speed is 25 knots. We have known the diesel engine output power, which is 1,925 kilowatt at 25 knots. So we can infer the propulsion power of the vessel, which is 1,849 kilowatts. Using this propulsion power, we estimated the fuel cell stack output power, which is 2,200 kilowatts. Considering hydrogen's lower volumetric energy density, we assumed the bunkering frequency being once a day. So we got the required hydrogen storage on board being 529 kilograms. Based on this power and the fuel demand, we designed a hydrogen power system for this vessel. The system has two independent branches, as you can see in this figure, left and right. If one branch has problems, the remaining one can continue to work. The fuel cell stacks and the battery packs work together to provide power. The battery packs boost the fuel cell systems in responding quickly to variable operating conditions of the vessel. When the vessel requires low power and the fuel cell system can generate extra electricity to charge the battery. We also designed backup plugins for the battery charging. The system requires 88 units of 350 bar Type 4 hydrogen cylinders. A vessel design is very sensitive to the weight and the size of the power system. Based on the equipment maker's manual, we got the sizes and the weights of the equipment for diesel and hydrogen systems. Let's look at the comparisons. On the left-hand side, the vessel's diesel system occupies 17 cubic meters, while the hydrogen system occupies 68 cubic meters, which is 4 times that of the diesel system. On the right-hand side, the vessel's diesel system is 15 tons, while the hydrogen system is 34 tons, which is 2.4 times the weight of the diesel system. So we can see that under the same propulsion power, the hydrogen system cannot be done within the existing design of the reference vessel. Redesign of this vessel is necessary to put the hydrogen system. If we don't redesign the vessel, it requires a substantial reduction in the vessel's propulsion power. So we calculated the propulsion power by reducing the volume of the hydrogen system to a comparable level with the diesel system. As the hydrogen cylinders can use the space on the vessel's roof, therefore we consider the volume of the equipment except for the hydrogen cylinders to be comparable to the diesel system. So the propulsion power should be reduced to 369 kilowatts, which is 20% of the original propulsion power. Reducing the power means reducing the vessel's speed. We also compared the cost. The left figure compares the cost for the two systems at the same propulsion power. The cost of a hydrogen system is around 3 times that of the diesel system. So finally, let's summarize the presentation. Using hydrogen as a marine fuel can help Australian vessels reach zero emission target. However, hydrogen's volumetric energy density is very, very low. leading to a small onboard fuel storage capacity, and we need to increase the bunkering frequency. And existing marine hydrogen fuel cell products are very large and heavy, posing challenges for vessel designs. So we need more compacted products from the industry. And to achieve the same propulsion power, the cost of the hydrogen power system is around 3 times that of diesel system. Advancing technologies and the market measures like carbon taxes are necessary to improve the competitiveness of the hydrogen powered vessels. So next step, we'll conduct feasibility studies for a broader range of representative Australian domestic vessels. And we'll consider not only commercially available technologies, but also emerging technologies still in research and the development stage. For example, the metal hydride storage technologies and the more efficient fuel cell technologies. So our project is still ongoing. I hope we can have other chances or webinars, maybe a few months later, to report our new findings. Thank you very much for listening.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Hongjun. I think you've highlighted some challenges, but also given us some reasons to be optimistic. So thank you very much for finishing us on that note. Thanks to all 3 of our speakers, Tom, Peggy, and Hongjun. Now I'd like to introduce Associate Professor Fatima Sahalehi from Macquarie University's Center for Energy and Natural Resources Innovation Transformation, and to lead us into our Q&A.
Thank you very much, Maya. It was fantastic to listen all this, talk, and I'm just excited to see how many great questions on the chat Q&A. So I'm just going to kick off with the first question, which I think it goes to Peggy. Do you see a future in producing hydrogen from seawater?
From the seawater, so which means not the pure water, just use the desalinate the seawater. I think the technology is there, and it should be okay, because a lot of African countries, they want to develop hydrogen. Actually, they need to do that. Otherwise, they lack of water to do that. And yes, my answer is yes. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Peggy. I should also apologize if there is a noise. I'm staying in a hotel at the moment. So the second question is also, for you, Peggy. It's about methanol. So hydrogen carrier and derivative methanol is already one of the world's most common traded chemical and available in all, almost all of the major ports globally. So it's more about, comment, but I just want to know your thoughts on that. So new builds order within the shipping industry have already made a huge shift toward dual fuel methanol. Example is Port of Melbourne. Just wondering what you think about that.
Yeah, I know, because Melbourne, they are collaborating with industry people to have a methanol bunkering in Port Melbourne. And as I mentioned, I think methanol could be the most doable, the fuel that used in the shipping, because now a lot of container, shipping company, they already order that. And that's why in Tasmania, I think ABL Energy, they already have the plans to produce methanol. And that probably the first, maybe the export methanol fuel will come from Tasmania in the near future. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. The next question is for Hongjun. So this is about the alternative fuels for shipping. So did this study on alternative fuels for shipping look at the required energy rather than the volume required to deliver the system energy content? So combustion engine and electric motors have significant difference efficiency in energy conversion to motion. Just wondering, what are your thoughts about that?
So in our project, we only focus on hydrogen and hydrogen's carrier ammonia. And this step, we only focus on hydrogen. So other alternative fuels, we have some comparisons from the life cycle emission perspective. But for this question, I think we don't have exact answer for this. I think, Thomas, maybe you can add something on this question.
Sorry, I've lost the question.
So the question is about the alternative fuels for shipping. So, actually, looking at the required energy rather than the volume required to deliver the same energy content.
So the required energy, so the way we kind of generally do it at the moment is we work out and say, okay, so if we're carrying 1,000 tons of diesel, that's generally we're carrying that. We don't want to waste space. So ships inherently want to minimize dead space or wasted space. So we're carrying it for a reason. Whether that's sometimes it's the fact that we want to bunker less often. What it means then is that when we go to that, we need to look at the alternative fuels. Now, we know how much energy is required to perform an operation. If we're looking at the bunkering, then you just take the volumetric energy densities and you can ratio that and say, okay, if I carry 1,000 tons of diesel, I need to carry X or 1,000 cubic meters of diesel, because generally for ships, we're more worried about the volumetric energy density as opposed to the gravimetric. 9 times out of 10, there are odd cases where it's different. So when I think, so if I just, instead of using cubic meters of diesel, I'm then going to have to carry a significant amount more. So methanol, I'd be looking at about 2,500 cubic meters. It's just, that's the energy that they carry. But then you can look at the prime movers. So we know an ICE isn't very efficient. Fuel cells are more efficient. If you're using that, all of a sudden, when you start adding that in, it makes things a lot easier. So you need to look at the efficiency of your prime mover, because all of a sudden you may not. But at the moment we're looking at like for likes a lot of the time. So we're looking at a diesel engine and assuming the efficiencies are the same.
Okay, thank you very
Fatima,
much.
can I add something?
Sure.
Because we have some consideration for different ship types. For example, if the oil tankers, we have an open deck, we can put bigger tanks on that. So that can offset some disadvantage of some low energy density fuels, for example, the LNG and methanol or something. And for the container ships, we don't have enough space for that. So we need to consider the under the accommodation area, and this very, very small space to put the low energy density fuels. Thank you.
Thank you. The next question, I think any of you can actually answer it. It's about cost of vessel running costs rather than OPEX. The audience are interested to know about that.
Can I start? Yes.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, for the OPEX, the main OPEX cost come from the fuel price. And for the hydrogen fuel cell solutions, we need to consider to replace some equipment. For example, the lifespan of the fuel cell stack currently is around 24,000 to 30,000 hours. So that means in the lifespan of the vessel, you need to replace these fuel cell stacks. But for the BOP systems, the hydrogen supply system, oxygen supply system, or the cooling system, you don't need to replace them. So this is the cost, one part of the OPEX cost. And another one is the battery cost, because the battery's life is depending on the depth of discharging. If you consider it's a 50% of the depth of the discharging, it's around 8,000 cycles. So in the lifespan of a vessel, maybe you need to change it 3 to 5 times. So there's another part of the cost. For the price of hydrogen currently in Australia, we checked the price board of hydrogen production in some states. It's around 4 to 6 Australian dollars per kilogram. But Australian government want to reduce this price to $2 by maybe 2030 or after that. So that would be, to some extent, it would be comparable with the diesel, price. But the extra price is that the bunkering infrastructures, that's very expensive now. So if you consider the bunkering infrastructure investment, that would be increased the hydrogen price, bunkering price, I mean. So I think the government need to do something, or the industry with the government collaboration project to do something to provide subsidies or some incentives, for example, carbon taxes or some other solutions can help to promote using this clean fuel on vessels.
Thank you very much, Han Jung. The next question is for you, Peggy. What element within the supply chain has been found to add the greatest value to the end user?
Peggy, you mute.
Sorry, Bill, my microphone has some issue. Sometimes I can hear, sometimes I could not hear. Yeah, so could you repeat the question?
Sure. This is about what element within the supply chain has been found to add the greatest value to the end user.
I think for the end user, it's really more the application side. So to me, it's that, be honest, I really like more although today we are talking about all the shipping or something, but really for the industry, heavy industry, if we could use that for greening all this production. And that's also related to one, I think participant asked about the added value, the green hydrogen into the final products and how port can prepare for that. I think that's probably the value I really look at could be the most important, and also can be realized quite quickly because that's domestic use. For example, in Bell Bay in Tasmania, if a Rio Tinto, if they could use all the production of the hydrogen into their production, and that's a green, mineral can be exported, and that's a value added to the port to export that. So that's just my thought. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Peggy. The next question is actually related to supply, to you actually, not supply chain. The question is what kind of incentives for port to support decarbonization are you expecting to be a reality in the coming years?
I think that Hongju mentioned how do we encourage port? So there are two parts. Is the port itself really are using hydrogen for decarbonization, and the other is they support the domestic industry or even the shipping industry too for decarbonization. So it comes to that, if that's later on, like a bunkering facility, so that's an incentive probably maybe related to government, how do they provide incentive, maybe subsidy for all the infrastructure development. It depends on the port management style. It's a public port or private port. And the other is for the domestic, supporting the domestic industry, such as aquaculture, all these vessels, or maybe the ferry, all these vessels, and then ports maybe have more incentive to support this kind of thing and to invest. So that's also some incentive. My view is more financial incentive. This could be the most important. Just like Japan or UK in their maritime regulation, they actually have such an incentive for ports to implement that using these renewables and to support the domestic industry in shipping or even the international shipping. Yeah.
Thank you very much. The next question, which was also voted, is related to the picture that you show about supply chain. It's mentioned is very energy oriented, and all the end user are energy related.
Yeah.
Do you think this is realistic? Shouldn't the application of green hydrogen also maybe predominantly encompass using the chemical industry and the non-energy applications to be considered?
But I think they all cover, because the green hydrogen could be, or their derivative could be used in the different sectors. So it could be the high heat, heavy industry like I mentioned, the steel, and also could be in Japan. They use initially they want to with the natural gas, the turbine, they want to all power co-firing the power plant. That's in their initial national hydrogen strategy they want to use. So that's why from this end, we export that, and then to Japan, they will go to their power plant for co-firing. That's also energy. Of course, a car also use that as a fuel. But I think apart from that, other sectors, as I mentioned, there are so many sectors could be decarbonized using green hydrogen and their derivatives. So it just, I think I remember like a building, and also the transport sector, and also the high heat industry, and that's all included. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Maybe just if there is a time, I'll go for the last question. This is for you, Tom. It's about new build and retrofitting. Is there any sustainability assessment, looking at the cost and benefit when it comes to the new build or versus retrofitting?
So it's going to be more expensive if you new build a vessel. The sustainability piece is very interesting. It's not sustainable to build a ship currently. We're using steel or metal that requires carbon to create it, especially if we're using steel, you're using carbon to create it, or the high heat anyway. So we've got to look at that. Ideally we want to retrofit. My personal view is that we retrofit existing vessels. There is a cost benefit. So if a vessel lasts generally 20 to 30 years, when you're up to the halfway point in life, you're better off retrofitting it for cost. When you go past halfway, as soon as it's come close to the end of life, you're probably better off from a cost perspective of building a new vessel. The problem then is what do you do with your old one? Because if it's still seaworthy, you want to make some money off it. Then it brings into what do we do as people, and our responsibility is that do you just sell that? Because then in theory that vessel is still going to be putting carbon in the air if you sell it. So we need to manage this a lot better. I mean, if I take fishing vessels in the UK, a lot of fishing vessels in the UK are actually second-hand bought from Europe. So then we have an issue. So the Europeans are going to go, we're building new vessels that are going to be green and they're going to be lovely, and we're just going to sell the dirty ones to the British. And then you have a problem there, and then the British have to deal with it anyway. So you do need to balance this out. I mean, there are solutions for how we do it. If you're going to retrofit, you put your fuel out. If it's ammonia or hydrogen, you tend to put it outside externally. You still need to do some safety case work, but you put it externally. New build, it just gives you that added value of installing it lower down below deck. I know methanol's popped up quite a bit in the chat. Methanol's lovely. All you have to actually do, other than the energy density, from a retrofit perspective, methanol's lovely. All you have to do is clean out your current diesel tank and respray it with a special coating. I think it's a zinc coating it needs. So you recoat it and then you can put methanol in there. So all of a sudden it makes life a lot easier and far better for the retrofit. And I'm probably going to answer another question a little bit. So where do we see with the fuels? Methanol is an ideal stepping stone towards a completely clean future. It still carries carbon. We're still going to be emitting carbon. It's not completely free. Even synthetic or green methanol, where do you get the carbon from? So you still need to get the carbon to create it. And then we're still putting it into that carbon cycle. It's far better than diesel, but you're still emitting carbon. It is a stepping stone. It's a transition. Methanol is a transition fuel, and it's far easier for a retrofit, especially for methanol, which a lot of small engine manufacturers are going methanol. Although methanol doesn't lend itself for fuel cells very easily because you then need to crack it. Same with ammonia. If we're using any of those with fuel cells, the problem is we've got to currently for PEM fuel cells, we need to dehydrogenate, and any chance of that getting through to the fuel cell will kill the fuel cell. They are ridiculously temperamental. They need 5.9 purity for hydrogen. Anything going through will kill it, which is, yeah. But then solid oxide fuel cells, hopefully that will come online because they will take methanol, they will take ammonia. You don't need to worry about it. All of a sudden, life's far easier and far better.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Thomas. I pass it to you, Maya.
Thank you so much, Fatima, for running such an energizing Q&A session. And thank you all of the participants for providing those questions and in some cases commenting on each other's questions. All I can think after hearing these different perspectives into decarbonizing the marine sector is just that it's an incredibly complex and rapidly evolving space. And so it's been awesome to get this really comprehensive mapping of the current landscape. and really exciting, I guess, to keep abreast of the research that continues to happen, given that it is so dynamic and there are so many questions still to be answered, but also reasons to be optimistic. So we've gone from a global survey all the way down to kind of specific design choices within vessels, and it's all been fascinating. So thank you again so much to our speakers and to Fatima, my co-facilitator. If you would like to refer back to this webinar, or if you know somebody who would benefit from it who wasn't able to make it, the recording will be available in the next few days. And please keep an eye on the Blue Economy CRC's events page on our website for any further upcoming webinars. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.